She had not eaten in 2 days. Abigail Langley sat in the saddle of her gray mare, Bess, and stared at the man standing in the doorway of the rough-hewn cabin, and she could feel everything inside her chest pulling apart at the seams. 3 days. 3 days of frozen ground and iron-gray skies and wind that cut through her wool coat like it was made of paper. 3 days of sleeping hunched against Bess's warm flank when the cold became unbearable, of eating the last of her cornbread on the first morning and refusing to stop, refusing to turn back, because turning back meant never knowing. And never knowing was its own kind of death, slower and quieter than the one that had taken Thomas from her 6 months ago, but just as certain. The man in the doorway was exactly as she had been told. Large, broad-shouldered, wearing a sheepskin coat over a dark flannel shirt, his jaw rough with dark stubble going slightly silver at the edges. His eyes were the color of a winter river, gray-blue and still, and they fixed on her with an expression she could not quite name. Not surprise. Not warmth, not yet, something more careful than either. Levi Morgan. She had asked about him in 3 different towns before she found anyone willing to tell her where he lived, and even then the man who had finally told her, a one-eyed livery operator in the town of Coldwater, had looked at her with something between pity and warning. "That's not a social call I'd recommend, ma'am," the old man had said. "Levi Morgan doesn't take to strangers, doesn't take to company of any kind, really. Not since," and then he had stopped himself, pressing his lips together. Not since what she had asked. Not since the inquest, he had said finally, and refused to explain further. She had ridden anyway. Now she was here, and the question that had driven her 3 days through bitter January cold was sitting right at the front of her throat, and she could feel herself shaking, and she was not certain whether it was the cold or the fear or something else entirely that she didn't have a name for yet. "You're Levi Morgan," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. The man said nothing for a moment. He studied her the way you study a thing that has appeared somewhere it has no logical right to be. Then he stepped out from the doorway, just one step, boot landing in the thin crust of ice-covered mud, and said, "Who wants to know?" "My name is Abigail Langley." She watched his face. "My late husband was Thomas Langley of Crestfall Creek." The stillness in Levi Morgan's face did something complicated then. It didn't break exactly, but something behind it shifted, like a load-bearing beam flexing under weight it had been carrying for a long time. "You'd better come inside," he said, and that was how it started. 6 months earlier, in the heat of a July that felt more like punishment than season, Abigail Langley had been standing in the doorway of her own home in Crestfall Creek, watching her husband ride away toward town. She remembered thinking that the dust his horse kicked up looked like gold in the afternoon light, and she remembered thinking that Thomas sat a horse beautifully, had always sat a horse beautifully, and that she was lucky. She had believed that. She had believed herself lucky. Thomas Langley was 34 years old when he died, which was only 3 years older than Abigail herself. He died of a gunshot wound sustained outside the Granger Saloon in Crestfall Creek on the 14th of July, 1882, and the official record said the shooting was the result of a disagreement over a card game, and the man who fired the shot, a drifter named Cole Reeves, had disappeared before the sheriff could take him in. That was the official record. That was what the inquest concluded. Abigail did not believe the official record. She had not believed it from the first moment she heard it, standing in the parlor of her own home while Sheriff Aldous Crane, a man who smelled of bourbon and looked at her with the particular kind of professional sympathy that costs nothing and means nothing, told her that her husband had been drinking, had gotten into a dispute over cards, and had been shot for his trouble. Thomas didn't drink. That was the first thing. Thomas Langley, in 11 years of marriage, had never once touched hard liquor. He had watched his father drink himself into the grave, and had made a private, permanent decision about it when he was 15 years old. The idea that he had been sitting in a saloon drinking and quarreling over cards was not just improbable, it was impossible. The second thing was the letter. She found it 3 weeks after the funeral, tucked into the lining of Thomas's good coat, the one he kept in the cedar chest at the bottom of their wardrobe. It was folded small and written in a hand she didn't recognize. It said very little, only a few lines. It said that the information Thomas had obtained was dangerous and that he needed to be careful about who he shared it with, and it was signed only with an initial, LL for Levi. It had taken Abigail 4 months to find that out. 4 months of careful, quiet, unobtrusive work. She was a woman alone in Crestfall Creek, and women alone in Crestfall Creek in the year 1882 were not supposed to conduct investigations. They were supposed to accept the official record and mourn their husbands and find a way to go on living. Abigail accepted nothing. She went on living, but she used every minute of it with a focus that frightened her, sometimes, in the small hours when she lay awake and felt how much of herself was now made of purpose rather than grief. The grief was there. She wasn't made of stone, but the purpose was stronger. She had grown up reading. That was the thing that separated her from many of the other women in Crestfall Creek, and it was not a separation she had ever used to make herself feel superior, only a fact about who she was. Her father had been a school teacher in Tennessee before they came west, and he had brought his books with him, and he had treated Abigail's education with the same seriousness he would have brought to any student, male or female. She could read and write in clear, precise English. She could do mathematics in her head faster than most men could do it on paper. And somewhere in the years of her marriage to Thomas, who was a surveyor by trade, she had learned his craft almost by accident, sitting beside him in the evenings while he worked, asking questions, reading the manuals he sent away for, until she understood not just the theory but the practice. Land surveying was a precise science in 1882, and it was almost exclusively male territory. It required mathematical skill, knowledge of instruments like the transit and the steel chain and the compass, and an understanding of legal land descriptions that most people found bewildering. Abigail understood all of it. She had helped Thomas with his work more times than he ever formally acknowledged, checking his calculations, catching errors, occasionally suggesting approaches to complicated boundary problems that he then solved and received credit for. She had never minded. She loved the work itself. The way the numbers resolved into shapes on the ground, the way you could take a legal description and turn it into something real and solid and bounded. There was a kind of truth in it that she found comforting. It was the surveying that had gotten Thomas killed. She was almost certain of it, and the letter signed L was the thread that led her, finally, to a name. She had spent weeks cross-referencing Thomas's old survey contracts with county land records, looking for patterns, looking for anomalies. She had ridden to 3 different county seats and sat in land offices asking politely to review public records, and she had found what she was looking for in the land records of Granger County. A boundary dispute, a massive one. 2 ranches, thousands of acres, and a survey that had never been formally completed because the surveyor had died before filing his final report. The survey had been commissioned by the county. The surveyor commissioned to complete it, according to the hiring records, had been Thomas Langley. And the man who had been hired before Thomas, the man who had abandoned the work suddenly and without explanation 3 months before Thomas took it on, was named Levi Morgan. She had felt cold all over when she found that. Not the cold of the January wind that would later batter her for 3 days in the saddle. A different kind of cold. The kind that starts somewhere in the center of your chest and spreads outward like ink dropped in water. She had allowed herself exactly one evening to sit with the worst interpretation. That Levi Morgan had warned Thomas and then had done something worse. That L was not a warning but a lure. That the whole thing was a trap, and Thomas had walked into it, and this man, this Levi Morgan, was the one who had said it. But she was too methodical to let the worst interpretation stand without testing it. That was the thing about mathematics. You didn't assume the answer before you worked the problem. You worked the problem. So she had gathered more. She had written letters, carefully worded, to the county surveyor's office in 3 different jurisdictions where Levi Morgan's name appeared in old records. She had talked to a retired deputy in Crestfall Creek, who had a long memory and a dislike for Sheriff Crane that made him more forthcoming than most. And slowly, painstakingly, the picture had changed. Not into innocence exactly, but into something more complicated, something she couldn't resolve without asking the man himself. Because the other thing the retired deputy had told her, leaning back in his chair on a cold December afternoon with his hands folded over his stomach and his eyes on the ceiling, was that Levi Morgan had been the one who'd brought information about Cole Reeves to the sheriff's office before Thomas was killed. Had brought it and been ignored. Had been told by Sheriff Crane that there was nothing to investigate, that Reeves was just a drifter, that there was no reason to believe he was in Crestfall Creek for anything other than passing through. And 2 weeks after Morgan brought that warning to the sheriff, Thomas Langley was dead. That was when the question had crystallized for her. Not 2 questions, not a dozen. One, singular and burning and worth 3 days in the January cold. She needed to know why Levi Morgan had left the survey incomplete. That was the key to all of it. If she knew why he had walked away from the work, she would understand whether Thomas's death was the result of someone wanting that survey to disappear, and she would know whether Levi Morgan was the man who had tried to stop it or the man who had been part of making it happen. Inside the cabin, it was warm. A wood stove in the corner threw out steady heat, and there was a smell of coffee and wood smoke and something else, pine resin maybe, that made the space feel solid and inhabited rather than merely occupied. The cabin was one large room with a sleeping area behind a rough partition, a table with 2 chairs, shelves along one wall crowded with books and papers and a few tools, and a window that looked out toward the line of bare-armed cottonwood trees along the creek. It was a surprisingly orderly space for a man living alone. That struck her immediately. Levi Morgan poured 2 cups of coffee without asking and set one in front of her on the table and sat down across from her, and for a moment they simply looked at each other across the steam rising from their cups. He was older than she had expected, or maybe just weathered. Not old, not by any reasonable measure. She guessed mid-30s, perhaps 36 or 37. The silver at the edges of his stubble was deceptive, she thought. The rest of his face was a younger man's face, though a hard one, with lines around his eyes from squinting at sun and distance, and whatever other things a man like this spent his time looking at. His hands on the table were large and rough and brown, and she noticed there was a faint scar along the outside of his right hand, old and faded. "You came to ask me something," he said. Not a question, a simple observation. "Yes," she said, "about Thomas." "Yes." He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup and looked at her steadily. "Before you ask, I want you to know that I'm sorry for your loss. I mean that. Thomas Langley was a good man." The plainness of it caught her off guard. She had prepared herself for evasion, for hostility, for the closed-off wariness of a man with something to hide. Not for that. "Thank you," she said after a beat. "Did you know him well?" "Not well. Corresponded some when he took on the Granger survey. He wrote to ask about my methods, about the southeastern boundary where the terrain gets complicated. We exchanged 3 or 4 letters. He was careful and precise, the kind of man who asked the right questions." Abigail felt a warmth move through her that had nothing to do with the wood stove. "That was Thomas," she agreed. "Mrs. Langley." He looked at her over his coffee cup. "You rode 3 days in January to ask me something. I have a general sense of what it might be. Ask it." She set down her own cup and looked at him directly, and she said the words that had been building inside her for 4 months, the words that had been the engine driving everything she had worked toward and everything she had sacrificed. "Why did you abandon the Granger County boundary survey?" The silence that followed was long enough that she had time to breathe twice, slowly, and to watch his face, and to see the way the question landed in him, not like a blow, but like a stone dropping into deep water, sending ripples outward through an expression she was learning to read. He got up from the table. He walked to the window and stood looking out at the cottonwoods, his back to her, and his hands were at his sides, not clenched, just still. The way a man stands when he is deciding how much truth to give and whether the truth will do more good than harm. "Because I found what the survey would have proven," he said finally, "and I understood that proving it was a death sentence." "The boundary was drawn wrong," Abigail said. He turned then. She saw the surprise in his face. She pressed on. "Not by accident," she continued. "The original survey filed in 1869 placed the eastern boundary of the Hartley land grant approximately 400 yards west of where it legally should have been. I believe that was done deliberately, because that 400-yard strip contains a reliable water source, and the ranch that benefits from the incorrect boundary is the Dalton operation. Dalton has been running cattle on water rights that aren't legally his for 13 years. A correct survey would expose that, and given the size of the Dalton operation, exposure would be financially ruinous." She paused. "Am I close?" Levi Morgan stood very still. He stared at her. She had surprised him completely, and she could see it, the way the composure cracked open for just a moment and something underneath it, something that looked like astonishment and respect and something cautious and wondering all at once came through. "You're exactly right," he said. "To the letter. To the yard." He came back to the table slowly and sat down again, and now the way he looked at her was different. The careful, measured assessment was still there, but it had changed quality. He was no longer assessing a grieving widow who had ridden 3 days in the cold on the strength of desperation. He was looking at someone who had done the same work he had done. "How did you know that?" "Thomas's survey notes," she said. "He left his field books in our home. I've been working through them since September. I was trained in survey mathematics. Thomas and I worked together for years." She held his gaze. "I believe someone within the Dalton organization, possibly Dalton himself, arranged for Thomas's murder because Thomas's survey would have corrected the record. And I believe Cole Reeves was hired to carry it out. What I needed to know was whether you left the survey because you were afraid or because you were part of the arrangement." Another silence. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods, and one of the bare branches tapped against the window glass. Levi Morgan looked at his hands on the table, and Abigail watched him, and she realized she was holding her breath. "I was afraid," he said. "I'm not proud of that. I found what the survey would prove, and then I received a visit from 2 men I'd never seen before, and they were not subtle about what would happen if I filed the report. I told myself I'd figure out another way. I told myself I'd bring it to the county assessor, to the land commissioner, to someone who could act on it without my name being the only one attached. I spent 6 months trying to find that person." He looked up at her. "And then Thomas took the job, and I wrote to warn him, and by the time I understood that the warning wasn't enough, it was too late." The letter. L. Levi Morgan. Abigail breathed in slowly. She felt the 4 months of accumulated tension, the sleepless nights and the meticulous work and the long, cold ride, moving through her all at once, and she kept her face steady because she was not done yet. "Who were the 2 men?" she asked. "I know one of them by name. A man called Burl Hatch. He works for Dalton as a kind of private enforcer. The other one I never identified." "Burl Hatch," she said. She had not heard that name, but she stored it. "Cole Reeves. Do you know if there's a connection?" "I believe Hatch hired Reeves. Reeves had a history, small-time violence, that sort of thing, the kind of man who gets used for ugly work. After Thomas died, I tried to track Reeves through some contacts I have in the county, but the trail went cold." Abigail reached into the inside pocket of her coat and withdrew a folded sheaf of papers. She unfolded them carefully and smoothed them on the table between them, and Levi Morgan leaned forward and looked at them, and she watched his face go through several expressions in quick succession. She had drawn the corrected survey, working from Thomas's field books, from the original 1869 filing, and from a set of United States General Land Office plats she had obtained through the county land office. She had reconstructed the correct boundary. She had checked her work 4 times. She was certain of it. The papers on the table showed the legal boundary of the Hartley grant, annotated with measurements and compass bearings, as clean and precise as anything a professional surveyor could produce. More than that, she had written out, in clear mathematical notation, the complete logical chain that demonstrated the discrepancy between the 1869 filing and the correct boundary. It was meticulous. It was irrefutable. Levi Morgan studied the papers for a long time. He turned one page, then another, tracing a line of notation with one finger. When he finally looked up at her, the expression on his face was something she had not anticipated. He was deeply, genuinely impressed. Not in the patronizing way a man sometimes looks at a woman who has done something he didn't expect, not with the slightly uncomfortable surprise of someone whose expectations have been mildly exceeded. He was impressed the way a craftsman is impressed by excellent work. It was the expression of a man who understood exactly what he was looking at and knew how much effort and skill it represented. "This is right," he said quietly. "I know it is," she said. He looked at her again, and something in the way he did it made her feel, for the first time in a long time, entirely seen. Not as a widow, not as a woman alone, as a person who had done a hard thing well. "Mrs. Langley," he said, "this document, if properly filed, would overturn the 1869 boundary. It would expose Dalton's water rights as fraudulent, and it would give the county grounds to reopen the investigation into Thomas's death." "Yes," she said, "I know. It would also make you a target," he said. "The same way Thomas was a target, the same way I was." "I know that too," she said. He sat back and looked at her, and the wind tapped at the window again, and the wood stove ticked with heat, and Abigail Langley looked back at Levi Morgan and did not look away. "You came out here in January," he said, "3 days in the cold on your own to ask me one question. And now you've answered the question yourself, essentially, before I could even—" He stopped. He shook his head slightly, and she thought, just for a moment, that the corner of his mouth moved towards something that wasn't quite a smile but was adjacent to it. "What is it you need from me, Mrs. Langley?" "Your testimony," she said, "and your professional certification of my survey work if you find it sound. I can't file this under my own name without someone dismissing it. You're a licensed surveyor. Your name on this document carries legal weight that mine does not." She held his gaze. "I'm not asking you to do anything I'm not willing to do myself. I'm asking you to stand alongside me." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You should eat something and sleep. You look like you haven't done either in 2 days. "One meal if you have it to spare," she said, "and then I'll need your answer." He got up and moved to the stove and began doing things with a cast iron pan, and what turned out to be salt pork and cornmeal. And Abigail sat at the table and watched the fire glow through the isinglass window of the wood stove. And she thought about Thomas, and about the 400 yards of land, and about the long cold ride, and whether any of it was going to amount to anything. He fed her salt pork and fried cornmeal and more coffee, and it was the best meal she had eaten in as long as she could remember, though she suspected that was partly a function of the hunger and the cold. She ate without speaking, and he sat across from her and watched her eat with a look that had nothing predatory in it, only a kind of attentive care that she found disarming. When she was done, he said, "There's a partition in the back. You'll sleep there. I'll take the floor." She started to protest, and he looked at her in a particular way that stopped the protest before it fully formed. Not commanding, not dismissive. Just certain in the way that a man is certain about the things he considers non-negotiable. She slept. She slept more deeply and completely than she had in 6 months, which disturbed her slightly when she woke and recognized it. The cold outside had gotten worse overnight, the kind of deep cold that settled into valleys in January and refused to move, and the cabin was warm, and she lay still for a while, listening to the wind and the settling of the wood stove, and she thought about Levi Morgan. He was not what she had expected. She had built a version of him in her imagination over 4 months, and the reality was different, more complicated, harder in some ways, softer in others. The silence he carried was real. She could feel the weight of it, but it was not the silence of cruelty or calculation. It was the silence of a man who had made a mistake that cost someone their life and had been living with that ever since. She understood that kind of weight. She was carrying a version of her own. She rose before dawn and came out to find him already up, sitting at the table with a lamp lit and her papers spread before him, working through the calculations by hand in a small notebook, checking her work. He had a cup of coffee beside him and a look of deep concentration, and he didn't look up when she came out, or not immediately. She poured herself coffee and sat down across from him and waited. He worked for another 20 minutes while the gray light began to seep through the window, and the wind outside dropped to something merely unpleasant rather than punishing. She watched him work and was struck, with a kind of quiet surprise, by how good it was to be in the presence of a mind she could respect. Thomas had been that. She had not realized, in the 6 months since his death, how much she had missed not just Thomas specifically, but the simple and rare experience of being in the presence of someone who was genuinely excellent at what they did. Levi Morgan finally set down his pencil and looked at her. "There's one error," he said. She felt her stomach tight. "Where?" He turned the notebook toward her and pointed. She leaned across the table and looked at the notation and the correction he had written beside it, and her first instinct was to push back, and then she looked at it more carefully and saw that he was right. A small arithmetic slip in a chain of bearings calculation, the kind of thing that could happen when you were working late at night and tired and pushing yourself too hard. It wouldn't have invalidated the conclusion. The error was minor enough that the corrected measurement fell within the margin that still proved the same point, but he was right that it was there. "Fix it," she said, "and then confirm it." He looked at her steadily. "I've already confirmed it," he said. "The error is small. The conclusion stands. The 1869 boundary filing is wrong by 387 yards, and the corrected boundary dispossesses Dalton of the water source he's been using without legal right for 13 years. He paused. "Mrs. Langley, I'll sign the document." She felt something move in her chest. Something that had been locked up and tightly held for a very long time. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "We still have to get this to the land commissioner's office without getting killed." Over the next 3 days, while the cold held and the world outside was locked in winter, Abigail and Levi worked at the table together, and she discovered something she had not anticipated. He was not merely willing to certify her work. He was genuinely collaborative, treating her as an equal intelligence, asking her opinions on aspects of the documentation strategy, deferring to her on the mathematical chain of evidence because her grasp of how to present it was, he said, clearer than his own. She found this disorienting in the best possible way. They argued twice. Real arguments, not performances of disagreement. The first was about the fastest route to reach the land commissioner's office in Harding City, which was the county seat with jurisdiction over the Granger boundary. He wanted to go around the northern ridge. She believed the direct southern route was faster by a full day, and that the weather risk was overstated. She turned out to be right, which he acknowledged with a dry practicality that she found more satisfying than excessive apology would have been. The second argument was about whether to send a letter ahead. He thought it created warning, gave Dalton's people more time to respond. She thought arriving without notice at a government office with documents requiring immediate attention was more likely to result in them being shown to a waiting room and forgotten than acted upon. They compromised, sending a brief, carefully worded letter addressed directly to the commissioner by name, citing the legal basis without specifying the parties, which she composed and which he reviewed, and which they both agreed was the best they could do. In the evenings, when the lamp was lit and the papers were put away and they were tired from the work, they talked. She had not expected that either. The conversation that began as necessary, as background information exchanged in the service of the shared project, gradually became something different, less transactional. She told him about growing up in Tennessee with her father, the school teacher, about the stacks of books in the house, about learning to measure and count because her father believed that a girl who could not reason from evidence was a girl left defenseless in the world. Levi listened the way people listen when they are genuinely interested, not just waiting for their turn to speak. He told her, in return and in pieces rather than all at once, about growing up in Kansas, about learning surveying from a methodical and exacting man named Gideon Marsh, who had told him once that the truest form of honesty available to a man was to get the measurement right, because the land did not forgive approximations. He told her about a marriage that had ended not in death but in departure, a woman named Cecilia who had left for the East 7 years ago, and whom he did not speak of with bitterness, only with the quiet sadness of a thing that had been genuinely attempted and genuinely failed. "Were you very much in love with her?" Abigail asked, and then felt the boldness of the question too late to retrieve it, but he didn't seem to mind. He thought about it for a moment, hands wrapped around a mug that had long since gone cold. "I thought I was," he said finally. "Looking back, I think we were both trying to solve a problem of loneliness, and we confused that with love for a while. It's an easy mistake to make." He looked at her. "You and Thomas." "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Genuinely. He was my best friend before he was my husband. We were matched in our minds first, I think, and the rest came from that." Levi nodded. There was a quality of respect in it, not for Thomas specifically, though she suspected that too, but for the thing itself, the possibility of it. "It shows," he said, "in the way you work, the discipline of it, the precision. That kind of work ethic doesn't come from nothing. It comes from being taught by someone who believed in you." He paused. "He was lucky to have you." She looked at the table for a moment. "I was lucky too," she said. They left for Harding City on the 4th morning, when the cold had shifted slightly, and the sky was a hard, clear blue, and the air had that quality of extreme winter clarity that made distances look both closer and more false than they were. Abigail rode Bess and Levi rode a dark bay gelding he called Drummer, and they rode mostly side by side on the wider stretches of the road and single file where the trail narrowed. He was watchful in the way of a man who had been in danger before and understood its geography, scanning the ridgelines and the draws, noting the places where a man on horseback could disappear. She was watchful too, and she noticed him noticing this, and she thought she saw something settle in his expression when he registered it, something that looked like relief. On the first evening out, they camped in a shallow coulee that blocked the wind and built a fire that was small and useful rather than large and visible. They sat close to it because of the cold, closer than they might have otherwise, and the warmth and the nearness created an awareness that Abigail recognized and chose not to examine too directly. She was not ready for it. She wasn't sure she was supposed to be ready for it yet. Grief had its own timeline and she had learned to respect it, but she also recognized, with the same disciplined honesty she brought to mathematics, that what she felt in the presence of Levi Morgan was not nothing. He cooked over the fire, dried beans and smoked meat he'd packed, and the food was simple and adequate and eaten in a companionable quiet that felt easy rather than awkward. Afterward, she insisted on washing the tin cups in creek water cold enough to make her hands ache, and he handed her a cloth to dry them, and their hands touched in the exchange briefly, and she felt it in a way that was disproportionate to the contact. She looked up and found him already looking at her. Neither of them said anything. The fire snapped between them. She looked away first, and then she heard him say very quietly, "You should sleep. I'll take first watch." "We'll trade," she said. 4 hours each." "You don't have to. 4 hours each," she said again and met his eyes, and he looked at her for a moment and then nodded. She slept for 4 hours wrapped in her bedroll and his extra wool blanket, which he produced without comment from his saddlebag, and when she woke to the sound of him speaking softly to Drummer and Bess, who were both restless with the cold, she lay still for a moment and listened and felt something terribly simple and complicated at the same time. She was glad to not be alone. She had been alone for 6 months. She had told herself that the alone was fine, that it was even useful, that it sharpened her focus and clarified her purpose, and that was true. But she had been telling herself a partial truth, the way you do when the full truth is too large to carry and still function. The full truth was that the alone was also very hard, in the particular way that being alone is hard when you have been genuinely, deeply companioned before. She got up and took watch without waking him from where he had settled against the coulee wall, and she sat with the rifle across her knees and the fire banked low, and the stars very bright and cold overhead, and she thought about what she was going to do after this was finished. She had not thought about that. She had been so focused on the question, on Thomas, on the injustice, on the evidence, that the shape of the life on the other side of resolution was completely blank. She was 31 years old, and she was a widow, and she had a house in Crestfall Creek that she mostly associated with Thomas's absence. She had a skill that the world had no formal mechanism for rewarding in someone of her sex. She had savings enough to last a year, maybe a little more if she was careful. She looked at the sleeping form of Levi Morgan and made herself look away. Harding City was a 3-day ride in total, and they arrived late on the third afternoon in weather that had warmed slightly, enough that the edges of the ruts in the main street were running with thin trickles of meltwater. The land commissioner's office was on the second floor of a building that also housed a surveyor's supply shop and a small printing operation, and the commissioner himself was a thin, precise man named Alastair Webb, who looked at them over wire-rimmed spectacles with the expression of a man who has seen every manner of frontier dispute and is quietly exhausted by all of them. But when he looked at the documents Abigail placed on his desk, the expression changed. She watched it happen, the way it happened with Levi, the moment of recognition when an intelligent person encounters work that is undeniably correct and knows it. Webb went through the papers slowly, moving from page to page, occasionally reaching for a reference document from his own files and comparing. Levi stood to one side and answered technical questions in a quiet, authoritative voice when Webb directed them at him, and occasionally Webb would glance at Abigail as if recalibrating his initial assessment of her role in the proceedings. "The certification," Webb said. He held up the page where Levi had signed his name to the survey corrections and the mathematical chain of evidence. "This is your professional signature, Mr. Morgan." "It is," Levi said. "And Mrs. Langley," Webb looked at her directly, "you performed this analysis yourself, working from the original field books and the general land office plats." "I did," she said. "You're welcome to test any part of it." "I already have," he said, and the dryness in his voice was almost appreciative. He set the papers down and folded his hands on his desk and looked at them both. "This is a serious filing. You understand that. The implications for the Dalton land holding are significant. There will be pushback. There will also be a cause of action to reopen the investigation into the death of Thomas Langley," Abigail said. "My husband was the surveyor commissioned to perform this work. He died before he could file his report. I believe he was killed to prevent this filing." Webb looked at her for a long moment. "That is a very serious allegation." "I know that it is," she said. "I have not made it lightly." Webb was quiet, and then he said something she had not expected. He said, "Your father, Mrs. Langley. Was he Oliver Langley, the school teacher, previously of Clarksburg, Tennessee?" She blinked. "No, my father was James Hartwell. He was a school teacher in—" She stopped. She stared at him. Webb said slowly, "James Hartwell. Good God." He set his spectacles down and pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of his nose. "I knew your father, briefly, many years ago. We were both young men then, and I was studying law in Nashville, and he was already teaching and trying to convince anyone who would listen that educating girls was not only permissible but necessary." He looked at her with something warm and almost wondering. "He used to say that the woman who could reason from evidence would outperform half the men in any field she chose." "He said that often," Abigail said. Her voice was slightly unsteady. "He was right," Webb said. He picked up her papers and tapped them square on his desk. "I'm going to file these today, And I'm going to write a formal referral to the state land board and a separate letter to the county sheriff's department, not Sheriff Crane, directly to the state circuit about the circumstances of your husband's death." He paused. "This will take time. The legal process doesn't move quickly, but it will move." They walked out of Alastair Webb's office into the cold late afternoon of a January day in Harding City, and Abigail stood on the boardwalk and felt the weight of the 4 months of work settle, and then lift from her in a way that was not exactly relief, because relief implied the end of danger, and this was not that. Only the end of the first part of the thing, but there was something in it. A loosening. A sense of something having been accomplished that deserved to be recognized. She became aware that Levi was standing beside her watching her, not intrusively, just present. "All right," he said. "Yes," she said, "I think so." She looked at the street, at the meltwater in the ruts, at a man crossing with a load of firewood in his arms and his breath making small clouds in the cold air. "I don't know what to do now," she said. "That's a strange feeling. I've known exactly what to do for 4 months." "You go back to Crestfall Creek," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "I suppose I do." But she heard the flatness in her own voice when she said it, and she thought he heard it too. They stayed the night in Harding City, at a boarding house on the main street, in separate rooms that shared a wall thin enough to make each of them aware of the other's presence in the quiet. In the morning they had breakfast together in the dining room downstairs, a room with 4 tables and a fire going and the smell of baking bread, and they drank coffee and ate eggs that a stout woman in a brown dress brought without ceremony, and they talked about the road back. "You shouldn't go through Granger County alone," he said. "Dalton's people will have heard something by the time we get back. The process will take months legally, but information moves faster than legal process." "I know," she said. "I'll ride with you to Crestfall Creek," he said, "and then I'll figure out my own next step." She looked at him. He was looking at his coffee cup, one thumb tracing the handle in a small repetitive motion that she thought was probably unconscious, something he did when he was working through something. "Where do you go after Crestfall Creek?" she asked. "I haven't decided," he said. He looked up. "I've been in the Morgan Creek cabin for 2 years now, and I'm there because it was convenient rather than because I wanted it. I don't have family in the area. I don't have a particular reason to stay." She didn't say anything, because she didn't trust what she might say. They rode out of Harding City mid-morning into a day that was overcast but not threatening, the cold gentled slightly by cloud cover that was doing its work as insulation. The road south through Granger County took them through open rangeland, wide and pale in the winter light, with stands of dark pine on the higher slopes and long empty reaches between the small settlements. They were 3 hours out of Harding City, crossing a stretch of flat open country where the road ran between 2 low ridges, when Abigail saw the 2 riders on the ridge to their right. She saw them and she didn't say anything immediately, just adjusted her posture slightly and let her right hand move casually toward the rifle scabbard on her saddle. Levi had already seen them. "Don't look," he said very quietly. "Keep riding, same pace." "2," she said. "I see them, there may be more." "If they wanted to stop us on the road, the choke point was a mile back," she said. "That draw between the rock walls, they missed it or they weren't ready. If they're trying to flank us, they need to come off that ridge and they'll lose elevation for 300 yards before they reach us." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Can you ride fast?" "Faster than you, probably," she said. "Bess is lighter than Drummer and she doesn't mind cold." This time the almost smile reached his eyes. "Then stay on my left and slightly ahead, and when I give you the word, you ride for that tree line." He pointed ahead where a stand of cottonwood and scrub oak edged the road maybe a 1/4 mile distant. "Don't stop until you're in the trees. I'll be right behind you. And if they come off the ridge fast, then we ride through them," he said, and there was something in the steadiness of his voice that was more than mere bravado. It was a man who had made a decision and committed to it. She kept her eyes forward and her breathing even and her hand near the rifle, and they rode on at the same pace, and for a long minute nothing happened. The 2 riders on the ridge were still, watching, and the flat land between was very quiet and the gray sky sat low over everything. And then she saw the third rider, below the ridge line on the left, already on the road perhaps a half-mile behind them and coming at a canter. "3," she said. "Left rear." Levi turned his head just slightly, just enough. "Now," he said, they rode hard. Abigail gave Bess her head, and the gray mare opened up with the long, ground-eating stride that she had always been capable of but rarely needed in the ordinary course of things. And the trees came toward them fast, and she heard the sound of drummers' hooves close behind her, and then the more distant sound of other horses. They hit the tree line, and she pulled Bess down to a hard stop-in among the bare cottonwood trunks, and came off the saddle with the rifle in her hand in one smooth motion. And Levi was dismounting beside her already, and they took positions behind the largest trunks, and she raised the rifle and sighted on the open ground between the trees and the road. The three riders pulled up short at the edge of the tree line, 50 yards out. She could see them, 3 men in heavy coats, one of them on a thick-necked roan, and they sat their horses and looked at the trees and looked at each other. She was steady behind the rifle. She was breathing slow and even, and her hands were not shaking. One of the riders called out, "We just want to talk." "Then come in slow with your hands in view," Levi called back. His voice was easy, almost conversational. The 3 men looked at each other again. She could see them calculating, weighing the angles, and she knew what they were seeing. 2 people in trees with rifles and the high ground and a long open approach with nowhere to hide. The calculation wasn't favorable. "Next time," the man on the roan said, and they pulled their horses around and rode back the way they had come. Abigail waited until they were out of rifle range, then let the barrel of her rifle lower slowly. She breathed out once completely, then stood straight and looked at Levi Morgan beside the neighboring cottonwood trunk. He was looking at her. Not at the retreating riders, at her. "You've handled a rifle before," he said. "My father's," she said. "Since I was 12, and Thomas's before that." She paused. "I'm a better shot than Thomas was." He was always the first to say so. The look on his face now was layered. The deep impression was still there, the same thing she'd seen in the cabin when he looked at her survey work, but there was something else in it now too, something warmer, something that was reaching toward her from behind the careful distance he maintained. She looked away before it could resolve into something she wasn't ready to name. "We should move," she said. "They may circle." They moved. They reached Crestfall Creek 2 days later, coming in on the north road in a late afternoon of very pale light, the town looking small and still against the winter prairie. Abigail knew every building on the main street, and the sight of them produced a complicated feeling that was not quite homecoming, because home without Thomas was a different thing than what the word used to mean, but it was familiar, and familiar had its own value. They put the horses up at the livery, and Abigail found the man she was looking for, the retired deputy named Harlan Briggs, at his house on the edge of town. She told him what had been filed with Commissioner Webb and what had been sent to the state circuit. Briggs listened with his hands flat on his knees and his eyes steady, and when she was done, he said, "Aldous Crane is going to know about this by morning." "I know," she said. "You should be careful," he said. He looked at Levi, who was standing in the doorway. "Both of you." "Burl Hatch," Levi said from the doorway. "Is he in the county?" Briggs' expression confirmed it before he spoke. "He's been in town twice in the past month. Nobody knows why. Maybe now we do." "He's checking on the situation," Abigail said. "Dalton will have heard something about the filing by now. Hatch is his eyes." Briggs looked at her with a mix of admiration and concern that she was becoming accustomed to. "Mrs. Langley, you have thought this through more completely than anyone I've seen in this county since," he stopped. "Well, in a long time." She went home. Her house was cold, all the fires long out, but structurally intact, and as she had left it, and she lit the parlor stove and made herself tea from the reserves in her kitchen and sat at Thomas's desk in the parlor and tried to feel the shape of the next days. There was a knock at her door 2 hours later. She answered it with the lamp in one hand and the other hand near the small revolver she had taken to keeping at her waist. It was Levi Morgan, and he was holding a covered tin plate. "Mrs. Briggs sent this," he said. "She insisted." She stepped back to let him in. He set the plate on the desk, and she lifted the cover and found fried chicken and potatoes and a wedge of cornbread, and she was more grateful than she had words for. "Are you staying in town?" she asked. "For now," he said. "Briggs offered me his spare room. It seemed prudent, given the situation." He looked around the parlor, taking it in, and his eyes moved over the bookshelves that covered most of one wall, and she saw the familiar expression of recognition that passed between people who had spent their lives surrounded by books and could identify that quality in a room immediately. "You and Thomas built a good life here," he said. It was not a painful thing to hear. It was true, and truth had its own comfort. "We tried to," she said. He looked at her. "How long has it been since you slept through the night?" She thought about it, honestly, not performatively. "I'm not sure," she said. "Since before July, maybe. I was worried about the survey boundary, about Thomas's contract. I knew something was wrong, but I couldn't prove it yet." "Sleep," he said. "I'll come by in the morning." She wanted to ask him not to go. She recognized the want and noted it and let it pass, because the timing was wrong and the grief was still real, and she was not a woman who acted on impulse in her own heart any more than she acted on it in her work. She slept. The legal process, as Commissioner Webb had promised, did not move quickly, but it moved. Over the following weeks, correspondence arrived from the State Land Board and from the Circuit Court, requesting documentation, requesting Levi Morgan's sworn deposition about the events surrounding the original survey abandonment, requesting a formal statement from Abigail about the circumstances of Thomas's death and the evidence she had assembled. Levi stayed in Crestfall Creek. He told himself, and told Harlan Briggs when Briggs asked, that he was staying because the situation was unresolved and it would be irresponsible to leave. This was true. It was also incomplete. He helped Abigail prepare the legal documents, sitting at Thomas's desk in the evenings with the lamp between them and the papers spread around them, and he discovered over those weeks that the feeling he had first registered in the cabin when she laid out the survey before him had not diminished. It had deepened. She was unlike anyone he had met. She had a mind that was genuinely precise and genuinely creative at the same time, a combination he found very rare, and she had a kind of direct moral clarity that was not self-righteous because it was not performed. She simply saw things plainly and called them what they were, and she expected the same from him, and when he fell short of that expectation she said so without cruelty and without drama. He fell in love with her over a set of legal depositions and a cold February and a shared anxiety about Burl Hatch, which was perhaps not the conventional sequence, but it was the true one. He did not tell her. He was not ready to tell her, and more importantly, she was not ready to hear it, and he was not a man who pushed. The situation with Hatch and Dalton resolved in a way that none of them had precisely anticipated. In early March, the State Circuit Court issued an order for the examination of the Granger County boundary records, and simultaneously the State Land Board suspended the Dalton water rights pending investigation. Dalton himself, faced with the prospect of a formal legal examination of his land holdings and the renewed attention to Thomas Langley's death, chose to cooperate rather than fight. His attorneys contacted the Circuit Court and indicated that their client had information about the events leading to Thomas Langley's shooting. What emerged from the subsequent legal proceedings was this. Cole Reeves had indeed been hired by Burl Hatch on Dalton's instructions to prevent the survey from being completed. Dalton had not, he maintained, and the evidence suggested was probably true, authorized murder. He had authorized intimidation. The line between intimidation and murder had been crossed by Hatch, who had told Reeves to do whatever was necessary and then looked away from the consequences. Dalton was prosecuted for conspiracy. Hatch was arrested and prosecuted for his role in directing Reeves. And Cole Reeves, when eventually located in the New Mexico Territory in May of that year, was brought back to stand trial for the killing. The legal proceedings took most of the year. Abigail was present for all of it. She gave testimony twice, once to the land board and once to the circuit court, and she gave it with the same precision and clarity she brought to everything. And the court reporter, afterward, was heard to remark to the judge's clerk that he had never taken down testimony so coherent and well organized in 12 years of his occupation. The verdict on Reeves came in October of 1883, 15 months after Thomas Langley was shot outside the Granger saloon. Guilty. The verdict on Hatch came 3 weeks later. Guilty. Dalton was fined a very large sum and stripped of the disputed water rights and avoided imprisonment, which was an injustice of a specific and infuriating kind that the law was entirely capable of producing. Abigail sat with that for a while. She was not satisfied with it. She would never be fully satisfied with it. But the record had been corrected. Thomas's death had been officially recognized for what it was, not a drunken card game dispute, not an accident, but a deliberate act carried out by men who had calculated that they could get away with it. They had not gotten away with it. It was enough. It was not everything. It was enough. Through all of this, Levi Morgan was there. Not intrusively, not in a way that imposed himself on her process or her grief or her work. He was simply present, consistently, in the way of a man who has decided that a place is where he belongs and is not in a hurry to be told otherwise. He took on some survey work in Granger County, the legitimate business of correcting and refiling boundaries in the wake of the investigation, work that kept him occupied and in the area. He had supper at her house twice a week, because she had started cooking for two without fully acknowledging to herself why. He brought firewood without being asked, and she did not tell him to stop because the winter came back hard and the firewood was genuinely useful. In December, 14 months after the cold January morning she had ridden up to his cabin door, they were sitting in her parlor after supper with the fire going and books open that neither of them was really reading, and Abigail said, without looking up from her page, "I've been asked to testify before the State Land Board in March about the methodologies I used in reconstructing the survey. They want to propose a formal protocol for reopening disputed land filings." "That's significant," Levi said. "It would mean traveling to the state capitol," she said. "It would mean being away for at least 2 weeks, possibly 3. "All right," he said. There was something careful in his voice. "I'd like you to come with me," she said. She looked up then and she met his eyes and she held his gaze and she said, "I'm not asking you to come for the testimony. You can come for that too if you want, but that's not the reason I'm asking." The quiet in the room was the particular quiet of something very significant being said very quietly. Levi Morgan closed his book and set it on the arm of the chair and looked at her across the fire. He had a look on his face that she had not seen before, or rather a look that she had seen forming piece by piece over 14 months but not assembled into its complete form until now. The careful distance was gone. Not the steadiness was still there, but the guard that lived behind the steadiness had come down. "Abigail," he said. It was the first time he had used her Christian name. She felt the weight of it. She felt how much the single word contained. "I've been here," he said. "These past months, I want you to know why I've been here." "I know why," she said. "I wasn't sure you, Levi." She said it the same way he had said her name, with the same deliberate weight, with the same care. "I know why." He looked at her for another long moment, and then he was across the room, not dramatically, not with a violence of motion, just with the resolution of a man who had been waiting and was done waiting, and he sat beside her on the settee and took her hands in his, and they were warm and rough and steady, exactly as she had imagined they would be. "I'm not Thomas," he said. "I know that," she said. "I'm not looking for Thomas. I'm not trying to replace what I had." She looked at their hands, at her slender, careful fingers in his large, rough ones. "I'm looking for what comes next. I've been looking at it for months, and it has your face, and I would like to stop pretending otherwise." He brought her hands to his mouth and pressed his lips to her knuckles, and the gesture was so gentle that it undid something in her that she had kept very carefully together for a very long time, and her eyes filled, not from sadness, or not only from sadness, but from the particular feeling of being held, really held, after a long time of managing entirely on your own. "Stay," she said. "Stop figuring out your next step and stay." "Yes," he said. It was that simple. It was that complete. He kissed her for the first time that evening, in the firelight of a room full of books, and it was nothing like she might have described to anyone if asked, because it was not a dramatic thing or a desperate thing. It was a careful, gentle, deliberate thing. The kind of kiss given by a man who has thought carefully about what he wants and has committed to it fully, and she kissed him back with exactly the same commitment. And outside the window the December cold was its own country, and inside the room the fire was warm, and everything, for that moment and all the moments that grew from it, was exactly right. They were married in the spring. April of 1884, in the small church on the west side of Crestfall Creek, on a day that was not quite warm but was trying to be, with yellow crocuses coming up along the front walk of the church, and the cottonwoods just beginning to think about their leaves. Harlan Briggs stood up with them as witness. The Reverend's wife, a kind woman named Dorothea who had taken a particular interest in Abigail's situation over the preceding year and a half, sat in the front pew and wept in a cheerful and enthusiastic way that Abigail found more comforting than she would have expected. The ceremony was simple. Abigail did not wear white. She had no white dress, and did not particularly want one. She wore her best dress, a deep blue wool that she had made herself in the year before Thomas died, and that she had not worn since the funeral because of that association, but which she wore today because she was determined to take back the things that had been shadowed and make them available for use again. Levi wore a dark coat and a white shirt and had shaved very carefully and looked, she thought, remarkable. Not in a pretty way. Nothing about Levi Morgan was ever going to be pretty, but in the way of something that has been designed for its function, and performs that function with complete fidelity. He looked at her when she walked in on Harlan Briggs's arm, and the look on his face was the best thing she had seen in a very long time. They said their vows in plain, direct language. When the Reverend asked Levi if he would take Abigail as his wife, Levi said, "I will," in the same steady voice he brought to everything, but she could hear the depth in it, the full weight of what he meant by the two words, and it settled in her chest like something fitting into its correct place. They moved her into the Morgan Creek cabin, which seemed at first like an odd choice, a cabin in the hills rather than the comfortable house in town, but which felt right when they were there together. They spent the first month making the cabin larger, adding a room on the east side that had enough wall space for the books, which came out from Crestfall Creek in 2 full wagon loads, and immediately made the space feel inhabited in a way it had not been before. He put up shelves with the focused efficiency of a man who understood that books were load-bearing elements of a home and needed to be properly supported. She went to the state capitol in the spring and presented her testimony to the land board, and Levi came with her. And while she was in the hearing chamber speaking in her clear, precise way about methodology and mathematical standards for disputed land filings, he sat in the anteroom and read one of her books that he had taken from the shelf without asking, which she had expected, and which pleased her. The land board incorporated her methodology into a formal protocol for reopening disputed survey filings. The protocol was named in the dry language of government documents, the Langley Morgan Standard, which was not what she had expected and which made Levi, when she told him, look at the ceiling with an expression that was trying very hard not to be proud and failing completely. "You should have told them just the Langley Standard," she said. "They asked for both names," he said. "I didn't correct them. You should have." "No," he said, "I shouldn't have." She looked at him for a moment and then looked away, because when he was like this, certain and quiet and completely sincere, she found him almost too much to look at directly. The summer that followed was the best summer she could remember in years. Not because it was easy. The work of running a household and managing the survey business and preparing more documentation for the ongoing land board review was not easy, but because the texture of the days was good in a way that she recognized as the foundational thing. She woke up every morning in the gray light before dawn and lay still for a moment, and felt the solid warmth of Levi beside her, still sleeping, usually on his back with one arm crooked up and his face in that particular state of complete unguardedness that sleeping people have. And she felt the kind of gratitude that does not need to be spoken out loud to be real. They disagreed regularly about small things and occasionally about larger ones, and the disagreements were good, the kind of disagreements that happen between two people who are both clear about what they think and are willing to work through the difference towards something better than either of them had started with. She taught him the mathematical shorthand she had developed for chaining calculations, which was faster than the method he had learned, and he acknowledged this with the same unsentimental practicality he brought to being corrected about the southern route to Harding City. He taught her to handle a transit in terrain that complicated the standard setup, which was genuinely useful and which she found, unexpectedly, that she enjoyed almost as much as the calculation work. In August she realized she was expecting. She told him in the evening after supper, in the way she told him most important things, directly and without ceremony. She was sitting at the desk going over accounts and he was reading at the other end of the room, and she said, "Levi, I need to tell you something." He looked up immediately, the way he always did when her voice had a particular quality. She told him. The silence was very brief, and then he was across the room and he held her, simply and completely, with his face against her hair, and she felt him breathing, and it was a minute before either of them said anything. "Are you well?" he said. "Yes," she said. "Very." He pulled back enough to look at her face, his hands on her shoulders, and the look in his eyes was something she had no adequate word for, something made of joy and solemnity and a fierce tenderness that she felt all the way down. "Abigail," he said. "I know," she said. Their son was born in March of 1885, on a night when the wind was still cold but had lost the killing edge of deepest winter, and the birth was attended by a woman named Martha Curry, who was the closest thing Crestfall Creek had to a midwife. Levi was present, which was not universally common for the time, but which she had insisted on, and which he had not for a moment considered refusing. He held her hand through the difficult hours, and he was exactly what she needed him to be, not helpless and not performatively strong, just steady and present and competent in the way he was competent at everything. They named the boy James after her father. James Morgan, with Thomas Langley as his middle name, a choice that Levi had suggested without prompting, which was the kind of thing he did that made her love him in a way that occasionally ambushed her with its intensity. James was a sturdy, serious infant who regarded the world with enormous dark eyes that gradually resolved, over the first weeks, into something that was clearly going to be his father's gray-blue. He was not an easy baby. He had opinions about sleep that were developed and firmly held, but he was healthy, and he was present, and he was theirs, and those facts were enough to sustain them through the opinionated nights. Harlan Briggs came out to see the baby in April and sat in the kitchen drinking coffee and looking at James with the expression of a man who has seen enough of the world to properly appreciate a beginning. "Your father would have been pleased," he said to Abigail, not referring to either Thomas or her own father specifically, but to both of them somehow at once. She understood what he meant, and she was grateful for it. She wrote to Commissioner Webb in Harding City to inform him of the birth, because in the year and a half of the legal proceedings he had become something close to a friend, and she felt he deserved to know. He wrote back a warm and slightly formal letter of congratulations, and included a note that the Langley Morgan standard had been formally adopted by 2 additional counties and was expected to be extended statewide within the year, which was the kind of news that made the whole long effort feel, in the best possible way, like something that would outlast all of them. The work continued. The world was not without injustice, and the law was not without its failures. And living in the territory in 1885 meant understanding both of those things with a clarity that city life might have permitted you to soften. The dispossession of land, the way the law bent toward those who had money and influence rather than those who were simply in the right, the precarious position of anyone who stood against the established arrangements, these things were real, and they knew it. But they had found, in their work and in each other, a kind of rigorous hopefulness, the kind that is not naive because it has been tested and has held. In the summer of 1886, Abigail discovered she was expecting again, which she announced with the same matter-of-fact directness as the first time, and which produced in Levi the same response, slightly more practiced in form but not at all diminished in feeling. She told him while they were both in the field on a survey job, standing in a meadow with the transit set up and the morning sun on the new grass, and he put down the field book and looked at her across the bright distance between them, and she laughed at his expression, which was helplessly happy. This one was a daughter, Clara Levi Morgan, who arrived in February of 1887 with considerably more speed and certainty than her brother had, and who turned out to have her mother's dark eyes and a disposition toward opinion that was immediately recognizable. James, who was too by this time and extremely interested in all developments, regarded his sister from the beginning with an expression of intense and proprietary affection that he maintained for the rest of his childhood. By the time Clara was a year old, the survey practice that Abigail and Levi had built together was known throughout 3 counties, not as his practice with her assistants, but explicitly as a joint operation, listed in the territory directory as Morgan and Langley Land Survey, the Langley in it a deliberate retention of her professional name in the work, something Levi had insisted on from the beginning. "The methodology is half yours," he had said. "The reputation is half yours. The name should be on it." She had not argued because he was right. They had a third child in 1889, another boy, who they named Oliver after her father's given name, a small red-faced and extremely vocal infant who settled into a cheerful temperament around the age of 4 months and never really changed from it. Oliver grew up to be the kind of child who made friends with everyone and remembered birthdays and talked to strangers at the general store, which was so different from both his parents that Abigail sometimes looked at him with a bemused pride that was entirely without explanation. The territory became a state in 1890, which changed some things and not others. The legal framework improved in some respects. The Langley-Morgan Standard, by this time in common use across much of the region, was written into the new state land code, which meant it had the force of statute, which meant that the work Thomas Langley had died for, and the work Abigail had ridden 3 days in the January cold to set in motion, had become, in a very real and durable sense, part of how the land was understood and protected. This was not something she could fully look at directly for a while. It was too large and too real and too tangled with grief and with love, and with the long road from that July afternoon, when she watched Thomas ride toward town in a cloud of gold dust. She visited Thomas's grave in the spring of that year, on a warm afternoon when the grass was coming up green and the sky was the specific blue of high-altitude spring. She went alone, as she sometimes did, not because Levi didn't understand but because some things are personal in a way that has nothing to do with secrecy. She stood at the headstone and said, out loud, in a clear and even voice, what she had done. She said it the way she would have said it to him if he had been sitting across from her at a table with his careful surveyor's hands folded and his full attention given, which was how he had always listened to her. She told him about the document and the filing and the legal proceedings and the men who were now held to account. She told him about the Langley-Morgan Standard and what it meant and what it would continue to mean. She told him about Levi, which was the hardest part, but she told it plainly and without apology, because Thomas would have wanted plainness from her above all things, And because Levi was real and present and good, and she was not going to diminish that by treating it as something that required justification. "You found a good one," she said to the headstone, eventually, which was the thing her father would have said in the same circumstances, the most efficient possible shorthand for a complicated feeling. She drove home in the wagon through the spring afternoon, and Levi came out from the barn when he heard her coming, wiping his hands on a cloth, and he looked at her face and saw what was in it. And he came to the wagon and helped her down and held her for a moment in the late afternoon light without saying anything, because he understood what the moment needed. Then James came running from around the side of the house, shouting something about a hawk's nest he had found in the cottonwoods by the creek, and Oliver was close behind him, making considerably more noise for a smaller person, and Clara was following both of them with the particular expression of a 4-year-old who has decided that whatever her brothers are excited about is probably worth investigating. And the afternoon became full and immediate and present in the way that afternoons with 3 children tended to become. Abigail stood in the yard of the cabin that had become her home, and she watched her children run through the spring light, and she felt Levi's hand find hers at her side and hold it, his thumb moving once across the back of her hand in that small, unconscious gesture of attentiveness she had been watching for years now and never stopped noticing. This, she thought, this was the answer on the other side of the question. She had ridden 3 days in the January cold to ask him one question, and he had answered it with the full truth, and then he had asked her to stay, not in so many words, not immediately, but in the way that a man who doesn't make careless requests eventually makes an honest one. And she had stayed. And everything else, the legal proceedings and the survey standard, and the children and the long warm evenings with books open, and the arguments about routes and the shared mornings in the field with instruments and the particular quality of being known by someone who found you worth knowing, had grown from that. She squeezed his hand. He looked at her. "All right," he said. The same question he had asked her on the boardwalk in Harding City after Commissioner Webb's office, the same words with the same simple care in them. She thought about the answer in full. She thought about what it meant to be all right, genuinely, in a life that had contained real loss and real fear and real work, and had come through all of it to here, this yard, this man, this light. "Yes," she said. "I think so. I very much think so." He raised her hand and pressed his lips to the back of it, the same gesture as that first evening in the parlor, and it still did exactly what it had done then. She thought it probably always would. The children were calling from the cottonwoods, something about the nest, something about eggs, the urgent ecological business of 3 children who have made a discovery and need adult witness immediately. Levi looked toward them with that look he had when the children needed him, attentive and unhurried, and he glanced back at her once, checking, and she nodded, and he went. She stood in the yard for another moment in the spring light, and she looked at the sky and the land and the particular shape of her life, and she found it good, genuinely good, not because it had been without pain, but because it had been fully met. The question she had ridden for, the one she had burned with for 4 months and carried 3 days in the cold, had led her here. Had led her through the truth and through the work and through the careful, honest, necessary process of finding out what a person is made of when the world takes the easy things away. She was made of mathematics and determination, and a rifle she had shot since age 12 and a love that had been first for one man, and then, after loss had done what loss does, had become available again in a form she had not expected, and had not looked for and had found anyway. She walked across the yard toward the sound of her children's voices, toward the cottonwoods by the creek and the hawk's nest, and the man crouching down to look at something small and important in the grass with 2 boys, and a daughter who had his steadiness and her eyes. And she felt the spring ground solid under her feet, and the sun on her face, and the particular joy of a life that was entirely and completely hers. In the years that followed, The story of the widow who rode 3 days in January cold to ask a surveyor the question that would expose a murder and correct 13 years of stolen water rights became one of those frontier stories that moves from person to person, changing slightly with each telling, accumulating small inventions at the edges the way such stories do, until the true version is slightly harder to find than the dramatic one. But the true version existed. It was in the land records and the court documents and the state land code and the professional directory of the territory under Morgan and Langley, land survey. It was in the 3 children who grew up in a cabin in the hills, with books on every wall and parents who argued about mathematics at the supper table and demonstrated, without ever making a lesson of it, that a life built on honesty and precision and mutual respect was a life worth building. It was in the way Levi Morgan looked at Abigail Langley across every room they ever occupied together, with the same expression she had first seen in a cold cabin on a January morning, the expression of a man encountering something excellent and knowing it. It was in the small arithmetic correction he had found in her survey notes, and the route through the southern pass she had been right about, and the 1,000 small moments of being genuinely, equally met by another person, which is the rarest and most sustaining form of love that exists. And it was in the answer she had given him, eventually, on the evening he had said quietly that she should stay. She had stayed, and it was the best thing she had ever done.